And that leads us to our penultimate or final part of this presentation, which is to answer the question, how did the hadith emerge? And so I think the sources are pretty clear that in the earliest period of Islam, there was actually a ban on hadith. So I call this the Khalifal Hadith Ban. Now, to be clear, I do not consider some Quranists, and not even Quranists, some just hadith skeptics, kind of paint a picture of a conspiracy that, and they'll kind of make claims like this: the hadith emerged only 300 years after the Prophet, and that, you know, it was kind of this smoke-filled room conspiracy that, you know, hadith were just generated in some sort of factory. I don't think this is actually how it happened. I think it was much more complex than this. I don't think it was this massive conspiracy. Yes, hadiths were fabricated, I think fabricated in mass in many cases. But for the vast majority of these kind of pious scholars, I don't think that they were just forging hadiths. I think there was some element of pious forgery that was going on. And we know that this was going on because they even generated hadith to defend this practice. There's a hadith that's attributed to the Prophet where he says, basically, if you see a hadith and it says something good, then it's from me. This is kind of giving the green light. This is kind of a wink and a nod that you can pretty much, if it's a good saying, you might as well attribute it to the prophets. So I think there was a lot of this pious forgery going on, which may not have been looked down upon as much at that time, perhaps. And then there was also just simply back projection. So there were, and I think this was probably the major case, that there were sayings of the Sahaba and the successors after them, that kept getting back projected further and further until they were put in the mouth of the Prophet. I think that's a natural process that goes on, and it's a gradual process. So there's not like one person that you can pinpoint and say that they were the reason why all this fabrication took place. So even somebody like Abu Huraira is often criticized amongst Quranists and Hadith skeptic circles. I've read a lot of Western scholarship that says probably Abu Huraira was just used as a name to attribute Hadith to. So maybe we shouldn't just jump down Abu Huraira's throat, because he may just be a name that was used. And the reason why, by the way, certain companions are used as narrators and others are not. And one of the things that people notice is that the big name Sahabis are not used in a lot of chains. The reason is it was all about age and years. In order to make a good isnad, you had to use as few links as possible. So what you wanted to use was the youngest possible Sahabi who lived as far out as possible, so that you could have a smaller chain. And that's why the names that are attributed are the way they are. So that doesn't mean that those Sahabis are the ones who are fabricating hadith. So I just needed to get that out there. Now, keep in mind that even Goldziher, whose research I really respect, and Muhammad Azmi, who tried to push back against it, both of them, so Muhammad Azmi tried to prove it, and Goldziher already had acknowledged it from before, the fact that it is very probable that the early Muslims recorded some of the words of their prophet during his lifetime and shortly thereafter. This is just a reasonable conclusion. After all, they would have done the same for other great figures, and we know that they did that. They did that for other companions, holy persons, successors, great scholars, etc. So, of course, they would do that for the prophets. But what we are contesting, however, is that this was meant to be a dual scripture alongside the Quran. In fact, it seems that the early Muslims, even though some of them may have recorded some of these reports of the prophets for the reasons I just told you, at the same time, early Muslims were aware of this danger, that there was this real danger that the hadith could then be elevated to the level of the Quran, since it came from the mouth of the same person, supposedly. Okay, now what I'm going to do is, I'm going to look, I didn't get a chance to translate this yet, but we're going to look at some sources now. So I'm going to look at this work. It's by the Imam al-Dhahabi, who was a very major 14th century hadith scholar, very well respected. All right, so we're going to look at this text by Imam al-Dhahabi. It's called Tadhkirat al-Huffaz. You just open it up to the very beginning, and you see they're talking about the first generation, which includes the Sahaba. This first section is about Abu Bakr. And you read right in the beginning this highlighted phrase. He was the first who was cautious about accepting al-akhbar, which are reports. So he displayed caution about accepting it. So that's the very opening of the text. They're saying Abu Bakr was very cautious about hadiths. We're going to look at this section later. This will complicate our view a little bit, but we'll come back to it. But here we see one of the first reports that Abu Bakr, he gathered the people after the Prophet's death, after their Prophet's death, and said to them, you all are narrating from God's messenger hadiths. You're narrating hadiths from him, and you're differing amongst yourselves in it. There's all these discrepancies amongst these hadiths that you are narrating. And the people after you are going to be even more severe in differences or in discrepancies. So do not narrate from God's messenger anything. And whoever asks you, tell them, between us and you, between us and between you, is Kitabillah, God's book. So whatever is halal in it, consider it halal, and whatever is haram in it, consider it haram. This was a rough translation. I'm just doing it on the fly here. But you see that Abu Bakr was the first Quranist, supposedly. I mean, this you could hear from a Quranist, right? And this is not from some random book. This is from Imam al-Dhahabi's text. And he is considering these akhbar to be reliable. He doesn't negate them or anything like that. He explains them away, we'll see. But these are reports that are, we're just going to look at reports that the people who are hadith scholars themselves used and then try to explain away. All right, so we're skimming down. This is another report about Abu Bakr. So Aisha, who was the daughter of Abu Bakr, said, my father gathered hadiths from God's messenger, and they were, amounting to 500 hadiths. And then this part is just talking about how he then spent the night kind of tossing and turning. He felt unrest, uneasy. And then in the morning, when he woke up, he asked his daughter to bring the hadiths that are with you, the hadiths that he was talking about. Bring them and bring some fire, and then he burned them. So this hadith is saying that Abu Bakr asked Aisha, his daughter, to bring all of the hadiths, and then he set them ablaze. And then she said, I asked, why did you burn them? And then this part is saying that he feared that, this whole thing is just saying that he feared that if he would die and they would, continue on, maybe they were not exactly as were narrated to him. So these kind of texts, we have to use very cautiously. On the one hand, I'm not trying to use circular logic and say that, I doubt all hadith, I reject all hadith, and yet here I'm using akhbar, which is kind of the same thing, to justify my argument. No, what I'm trying to do is, as a historical scholar, is as a historian, from a historian perspective, I'm trying to figure out what was the process what were the views in early Islam? Whether or not Abu Bakr actually said any of this, and this was actually what happened with Abu Bakr, we can't say for certain. But what we can say is that early on, there was this hesitancy towards the hadith canon, and it was back projected onto the first caliphs, who probably were against narrating anything other than the Quran. This is the conclusion that a historian would reach. And we can continue on. So let's look at some reports. But now we're at number 2, and this is about the second caliph, Umar. We can see some reports that are attributed to him. So in this report, Umar, the second caliph, is sending off some sahabis, a couple sahabis to Iraq. And he says that you will pass by the people of a village, and you'll hear this kind of buzzing of the Quran in this village. They're going to be reciting the Quran, like it'll be like the buzzing of bees. And then this next part basically says, so don't distract them, don't distract them from the Quran. And this part is really important right here. Lesson, it's an imperative, lesson narrations from God's messenger. And then this basically says, I interpret this as being like, I will do the same. And at the end of this hadith, this report, this akhbar, this khabar, you see that Umar is reported to have banned us from what? From narrating and transmitting hadith. So what we see is we're seeing a tension here. On the one hand, yes, there are some reports of the prophets. Nobody's denying that. On the other hand, there is this concern that this will rival the Quran. And so then there is this move to kind of prescribe that and to ban that. So, and we're going to try to explicate this tension a little bit. All right. And then this next section here says that basically they were able to, this is asked about, were you able to narrate the hadith in the same way in the time of Umar? And this Sahabi says, no, I was not, because otherwise he would hit me. He would strike me with his whisk. So we see that there was a ban on hadith. And it was only after this ban was lifted, after the second caliph, maybe after, we don't know if it's in the third caliphate or afterward, but initially it was something that could get you into legal trouble. In fact, in this next narration, we see that Umar actually imprisoned 3 people, all right? And it lists 3 Sahabis who were supposedly imprisoned for. What were they imprisoned for? Because they proliferated hadith from God's messenger, all right? And then in this one, we see basically this Sahabi is saying that Umar, the second caliph, would strike fear, like he would scare people from narrating from God's messenger. So coming back to, so we see the first 2 caliphs. There's some evidence for my argument, and there's some evidence that kind of puts some tension into my arguments. Because a traditionalist could say, this is just saying to be careful and scrupulous when you transmit hadith. And this is how this author himself is going to justify these kind of reports, and how we'll see some other traditionalist scholars of the past have justified these hadith. I believe that there's another more obvious explanation. I think that what happened was that after the Prophet died, it was only natural to, when a new event happened, to see if there was some precedent from the Prophet. This was kind of a slippery slope, and they already knew that it was a slippery slope, and they feared that it could become a rival canon with the Quran. And so this is the tension that happened very early on in Islam, I believe. And this is this passage that reveals this, because what you have is a grandmother who comes seeking some inheritance, and they don't know what to do. And then there's a report that, what the Prophet supposedly, his practice was. So I believe it was in this kind of, probably even in inheritance specifically, where this became a key issue. And this, looking for precedents, slowly snowballed into the phenomenon of hadith. But this was a gradual process. And the first 2 caliphs were aware that this snowballing process could take place and that it should not happen. So this is how I explain how hadith probably emerged. Now, whether or not this process happened in the first 2 caliphs, I'm not sure. Whether or not we think that these events actually happened during their time or was back projected on them, we don't know for certain. But what we can say is that this is a very plausible theory about how hadith came about. But always from the very beginning, there was a fear that don't make a book like the Mishna that the people of the book have. And we're going to look at some of those. So we have more sayings that are attributed to the second caliph. Do you really want a Mishnah like the Mishnah of the people of the book? By God, I will never clothe God's book with anything. I will never cover up God's book. And this is another very important book, Taqid al-Ilm, which has been translated. So that one you can go straight to the academic translation by Aisha Musa, who's done some great work on hadith. It was written by Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi, who was also a major hadith scholar. And you can just go through his book and you see all of these kind of narrations. In this, Umar is attributed to say, quote, I remembered that a people before, so I had wanted to put the Sunnah in writing, but then I remembered that a people before you wrote books, became devoted to them, and neglected God's book. Who is he talking about? He's talking about rabbinical Judaism and the Mishnah. As for me, by God, I will never cover God's book with anything. And this is repeated in many different narrations. Here's another one. I recall that some people of the book before you had written a book with which they covered God's book. Then they abandoned God's book. As for me, by God, I will never cover God's book with anything. Thus, Umar abandoned putting the Sunnah in writing. Another one. It has reached me that books of hadith have appeared amongst you. I wish to God to rectify and amend that. So everyone who has a book, bring it to me. Then he burned them. Afterward, he said, this is a desire like the desire of the people of the book. I think we can go back to the, what Jonathan Brown said in his book, where he clearly says, and I gave those quotes in that first video, although we can quickly go through it right now, actually, because it would be good to remind ourselves. This is Jonathan Brown's, who's the best defender of hadith, in my opinion, and at least in the English language that I know of, where he admits that the hadith is the equivalent of the oral Torah, and he even mentions the Mishnah by name. And he says, if you want to ask, what does Islam say about an issue? Don't go to the Quran. You go to the hadith, the Sunnah. That is what the curious reader should go to. Is this not but a fulfillment of the fear that is expressed in the views of these early caliphs and the early Muslims? I think it is. So even though, yes, it is very likely that some words of the Prophet, other than the Quran, may have been circulating, there was a fear early on that this would rival the Quran. And this is exactly what happened, to the point now that the Sunnah rules over the Quran. So there's a famous legal maxim, and Jonathan Brown is quoting it here, that the Sunnah, which is the hadith, rules over the Quran, not the Quran over the hadith or the Sunnah. This is a famous legal maxim. And the reason is, if you all, so the traditional explanation is that, no, we don't put the hadith above the Quran. Of course, everyone acknowledges that the Quran is above the everything else. This is simply a formal ontological claim, but in reality, or even a ritualistic claim, that in ritual, yes, we only recite the Quran in prayer. But when it comes to legal rulings, action, then it's always the hadith and the Sunnah, in my opinion, which rule over the Quran. And it's embodied in that maxim, that legal maxim that Jonathan Brown quotes, that the Sunnah rules over the Quran, not the Quran over the Sunnah. And the reason is because the standard argument is for the hadith that you need the hadith or the Sunnah to explicate the Quran. So the Quran only uses generalized statements, universal generic statements, and the hadith is very detailed and specific. Now, let me ask you something. If you have this kind of relationship, which text are you going to rely upon for action? It's always going to be the more detailed and specific one. And that's why you see in traditional Islam, the hadith and the Sunnah is always, almost always prioritized over the Quran. In fact, and then we can talk about this later, but this is when I got involved in a Twitter war. I gave examples of this. The examples I gave are, the most famous example I would give is of stoning. Stoning is not in the Quran. What is in the Quran? A different punishment. And yet, for adultery, what punishment is given as the standard punishment? In fact, it's supposedly, there's ijma on it, and consensus, you cannot defer on this. Well, that's from the hadith. And even there, go to the extent of, even the ones who claim that you can't, hadith can't abrogate the Quran, or the Sunnah can't abrogate the Quran. What do? They just invent hadiths or reports about a supposed mysterious verse of the Quran that was eaten by a goat, and that's how they justify it. So in any case, the hadith always wins, whether it means inventing hadiths to invent Quranic verses, or simply saying that hadith abrogates the Quran. Either which way, the hadiths always win out. There are more sayings, many more sayings. I'm not going to get into them now, but you can just take a look at Aisha Musa's translation of this text. You see that there are many other companions who voiced or were attributed to have said similar statements about how don't make a book alongside the Quran. And they were specifically talking about hadith, by the way. Now, how does al-Baghdadi, Khatib al-Baghdadi, how does he himself explain away these narrations? Because he's not negating these narrations. He says, and this is the standard explanation, at the beginning of Islam, books of knowledge were prohibited. And knowledge, by the way, ilm, it usually just means transmitted knowledge, which is hadith. So it's almost synonymous with hadith. So books of hadith were prohibited because at that time there were no scholars who could distinguish between what had been divinely inspired and what had not. Yet I thought Sunnah and hadiths were also divinely inspired. So this is kind of a problematic argument. Also, although I acknowledge that the fear was that the two could be mixed up in the same book, this is the standard explanation. So the standard explanation, by the way, let's back up a little bit. There are hadiths that are attributed to the Prophet himself, in which he has supposedly said he prohibited writing hadith and or narrating hadith, but definitely recording hadith. And some Qur'anists will use these kind of hadiths against their opponents. This is a bit of circular logic. There is a flaw in it. Now, you could justify it by saying, I'm only making a dialectical argument. You accept these hadiths, that's why I'm using them. Muslims, after all, use this against Christians when it comes to certain biblical verses. But I don't think it's a strong argument. There are other hadiths also attributed to the Prophet in which he says that I once prohibited you from it, but now it's okay. Or they don't even clearly say that. They just say that it is permitted for you to write. One thing that you'll notice about the hadith, which is why it's such a problematic source to begin with, is that you can find almost all views in the hadith. Why? Because everybody's generating fake hadith. Even the people who are against hadith are generating hadith to go against hadith. People who are defending hadith are also generating hadith to defend hadith. People who are trying to push back against forging hadith are forging hadith to defend, to say don't forge hadith. That's how ironic it gets, actually, which shows you how problematic it is. So actually, I believe it was, I think it was Yunbal who did a very good, he wrote an article or a chapter on supposedly the most mutawatir of the most mutawatir hadith, supposedly man kazaba alayhi, alayhi, the one, whoever attributes a lie to me, let him take his seat in fire. That is narrated in many different ways. This is supposedly considered the most mutawatir hadith, mass transmitted, completely certain. Yet in his study, he shows that even this hadith is fabricated, is not reliable, and if even the most mutawatir hadith doesn't stand up to scrutiny, then what of all the other hadith? I don't even think you can go and look at his book chapter, but just think about it. That entire matan, the content of that hadith, think about it critically for just a second. Take off your sectarian hat for just a second and use your brain. You can tell that that's a forged hadith, right? Whoever attributes a lie to me, when do you think, use your brain, when do you think that was generated this hadith? It was generated in a time in which people were forging hadiths. Someone decided we need to stop this. So what do you do to stop it? You create a hadith that says that if you forge hadith, you have your seat in hellfire. This is what's called a pious forgery. So this is the case with even the most reliable hadith. What about all the other hadith? So, this is something to keep in mind. But the key point here now, coming back to what al-Baghdadi is saying, yes, there may have been a fear that the two would mix up, that the words of the Prophet would mix up with the Quran on the same page or in the same book. But keep in mind, we read all of those reports. What did they talk about? They talked about another book rivaling the Quran. So their fear was that hadiths were compiled in books, and that's why many of the sayings that are attributed to all these other companions as well, they're worried about all these books of hadith, and that they call it just books of knowledge, ilm, which is a term for hadith. Their worry is that those will rival the Quran, and this is way after, by the way, that this kind of Khatib al-Baghdadi is writing hundreds of years later. The Quran is already secured by this time. And yet there was still a fear. He had to push back against this fear of writing books. What kind of books? Not any kind of books. They already had tons of books. There was still 300, 400 years after this resistance to writing down hadiths in books. And the reason was because of this fear attributed all the way back to Umar and Abu Bakr of a book rivaling the Quran. And so that's the real explanation. So what I want you to do is when you look back at these sources, as a critical scholar, you should not just take their explanations at face value. You should say, is the proof that they themselves are bringing up, does it match up with their explanation? I would argue in this case, it does not. So I already told you that there were hadiths for and against writing hadiths. These are clearly all later forgeries. Schuler has a really good explanation for the order he thinks that these were generated. So if you can